She said yes to a message from a stranger, and by the time the sun came up, 3 people she barely knew had already decided how her night would end. There was no red flag, no hesitation, nothing that would have made her think twice, because there was nothing to see. Just an ordinary invitation on an ordinary Saturday from someone who came across as harmless enough to trust. By the time anyone realized something had gone wrong, she'd already been gone for days. This is a case about how easily a normal night can be turned into a trap by people who had all the time in the world to plan it, and about how long it can take for the truth to catch up to the people who built it. If you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe before we get into it, because you're going to want to see how this one unravels. And while you're at it, drop a comment and tell us what city or country you're watching from tonight. Her name was Maya Fuller. She was 22 years old, living just outside Nashville in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, a college town where the pace of life is set by class schedules and shift work. And Maya was usually on the shift work side of that equation. People who knew her didn't describe her as flashy or loud. They described her as sharp. Her own mother didn't hesitate to call her a genius, and she meant it without a shred of exaggeration in her voice. Maya was the kind of young woman who showed up, did the job in front of her, and quietly built her life one paycheck and one plan at a time. She wasn't chasing attention. She was chasing stability, the way a lot of 22-year-olds are, juggling work and family and whatever social life fits into the cracks in between. She was close with her family in a way that mattered here later. Not distant, not the kind of relationship where weeks go by without a check-in, Maya called. She kept people updated. She was the type of daughter who didn't disappear without a word, which is a big part of why what happened next didn't make sense to anyone who loved her. Not at first, and honestly, not ever, no matter how many times they've replayed it since. The last weekend of July 2022 looked like every other weekend before it, right down to the small, forgettable details that only matter in hindsight. On Friday, she spent time with her family. Nothing special happened. No last conversation anyone can point to and say, that's when we should have known. Just an ordinary Friday evening, the kind that blends into every other Friday evening a person has ever had. On Saturday, she clocked in for a shift at the soccer stadium in Nashville, working an event the same way she'd worked plenty before it. She did her job. She clocked out. That's the entirety of her Saturday afternoon, as far as anyone around her could reconstruct later. A shift like any other, ending the way every one of her shifts had ended before. When she said goodbye to her family that weekend, nobody treated it like a goodbye, because there was no reason to. It was the kind of casual "see you later" that gets said 1,000 times without a second thought, the kind that only takes on weight after the fact, when a family is forced to go back and search every ordinary moment for some sign they missed. But somewhere else in the city, completely outside Maya's awareness, someone had already started thinking about her. Someone was searching her name online, scrolling through her profile, working out how they were going to reach her. And whatever they were building toward had nothing to do with the young woman clocking out of her shift and heading home to get ready for what she assumed was going to be a normal Saturday night. That gap between what Maya believed was happening and what was actually being set in motion without her knowledge is the entire engine of this story. Everything that follows happens because one side of that gap had no idea the other side existed. Before the story moves forward, it matters to actually sit with who Maya was, because it's easy in true crime storytelling to let a victim become a plot device, a name attached to a timeline mentioned only in the context of what was done to her. Maya doesn't deserve that. She was, by every account from people who actually knew her, someone who took her responsibilities seriously in a way that a lot of 22-year-olds haven't quite figured out yet. She held down steady work. She showed up for her shifts. She stayed close to her family instead of drifting away from them the way so many people do in their early 20s, chasing independence at the cost of connection. Maya seemed to have found a way to hold both, independence and connection, without sacrificing either one. None of that protected her. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting at the heart of this entire case. Being responsible, being close with your family, being the kind of person who checks in, none of it is a shield against someone who has already decided to hurt you before you've even met them. Maya did everything people are told to do to stay safe, and it made no difference at all, because the danger she walked into wasn't the kind any of those precautions were built to catch. The night before all of this, Maya crossed paths with a 21-year-old woman named Tiana Tipton. What exactly was said between them has never been fully spelled out in court, and in a lot of ways, it barely matters, because whatever the disagreement actually was, by every available account, it was small. The kind of friction that happens between strangers or near strangers constantly in any city, on any given weekend. No weapons, no injuries, just words, and then two people walking away from each other, the way arguments like this overwhelmingly tend to end. For Maya, that's precisely how it ended. She went home. She got up the next morning. She went to work like it was any other Saturday, because as far as she was concerned, it was exactly that. There's nothing in this case. No testimony, no evidence, nothing. To suggest Maya gave Tiana Tipton a second thought after that night. She had no reason to. In her mind, the disagreement was already behind her. Tipton, though, wasn't finished with it. Not by a long shot. Instead of letting the argument fade the way most people do, Tipton carried it home with her. And by the very next day, she'd reshaped it into something far more deliberate. Not a grudge she'd eventually shake off, but a plan. This is the exact point where an argument turns into something else. A decision. A decision that separates Tiana Tipton from just about anyone else who has ever lost an argument and moved on with their life. She decided Maya needed to answer for it, physically. But there was a practical problem standing in her way. Maya already knew what Tipton looked like. If Tipton approached her directly, Maya would see the danger coming from a mile away and have every reason to be on guard. So Tipton did something colder and far more calculated than confronting Maya herself. She turned to someone who could get close to Maya without raising a single alarm bell. Someone Maya had never met, had no reason to distrust, and would have no way of connecting to the argument from the night before. Her own younger brother. Pause on that decision for a second, because it's the hinge the rest of this case swings on. Up until this point, everything about this story is depressingly familiar. Two strangers get into a heated exchange, feelings get hurt, words get said that shouldn't have been. That happens constantly, in every city, on any given weekend, and the overwhelming majority of the time, it ends the way it started, with two people who never see each other again. What makes this case different isn't the argument. It's the fact that one person involved in it refused to let it end there, and had both the anger and the patience to build something out of it instead. His name was Ty Sean. He was 20 years old, and according to prosecutors, he was fully aware of the argument between his sister and a woman he had never personally met. He knew his sister was angry. He knew what she wanted done about it. And armed with that knowledge, he did something that would end up defining the rest of his life. He opened Maya's page online, looked through it long enough to figure out how to approach her convincingly, and reached out. Take a second to put yourself in Maya's position here. A message arrives from someone with zero apparent connection to an argument that happened the night before. Someone she has no reason to be wary of, no reason to think twice about. At 22, invitations like that land in your messages all the time. From promoters, from mutual friends, from people you half know who happen to be hosting something that night. Saying yes to it wasn't careless on Maya's part. It was completely, unremarkably normal, the kind of decision any of us would make a dozen times a month without giving it a second thought. The invitation itself was simple. There was a party that night at a nightclub in South Nashville, right off one of the busiest commercial strips in the city. And here's what makes this particular chapter of the case so hard to accept. None of this happened in a sudden burst of anger. There was time built into every single step, deliberately or not. Tipton had a full 24 hours to cool off, and she didn't take a single one of them. Her brother had to find a stranger's profile online, study it enough to know how to approach her convincingly, write a message, send it, and then keep that conversation going long enough for Maya to actually agree to come out, at any point along that timeline, while typing the message, while waiting for a reply, while confirming the plan for the night. Both of them had a chance to back out. That chance never got used. And they weren't operating alone. A third person, 20-year-old Lamira Pipkins, close with both Tipton and her brother, was already looped into the plan by the time that invitation went out. When the night actually arrived, she wasn't going to be standing on the sidelines watching. She had a role to play, and everyone involved seemed to understand exactly what that role was. So picture the pieces sliding into place as the sun goes down over Nashville that evening. Maya, fresh off a long shift at the soccer stadium, getting ready for what she genuinely believes will be a good way to close out her week. A party, some music, a chance to unwind after a full day on her feet. Meanwhile, across the city, Tipton is still carrying a full day's worth of unresolved anger. Pipkins is standing by, ready to play her part when the moment comes. And Tyshawn, the friendly stranger whose one message started all of it, is waiting to see whether Maya will actually show up. She got dressed, she headed out. And she had absolutely no idea that 3 people had spent their entire day preparing for the exact moment she walked through that door. There's something to name here, because it's the real thread running underneath this whole case. None of what happened to Maya required her to make a bad decision. She didn't ignore a warning sign. She didn't take an unnecessary risk. She simply responded to a friendly message the same way almost anyone her age would have. The plan didn't need her to slip up. It only needed her to be a normal 22-year-old on a Saturday night, and that's precisely who she was. Before we follow Maya into that nightclub, let's break down what actually made this plan work, because understanding the mechanics of it is the whole reason a case like this deserves to be told in the first place. Most people, when they picture danger, picture something they can recognize in the moment. A stranger who feels off, a situation that looks wrong, a red flag that gives them a reason to leave. This plan was built specifically around avoiding all of that. Tipton understood, correctly, that she herself was the one red flag Maya would recognize instantly. So she removed herself from the equation entirely and replaced herself with someone Maya had absolutely no reason to be cautious around. This is the piece of the plan that should genuinely unsettle anyone watching it, because it isn't really about Maya at all. It's about how a scheme like this can be built around any of us. The entire strategy relied on a basic, reasonable assumption almost everyone makes every day, that a message from someone with no visible connection to a conflict is safe to respond to. That assumption isn't naive, it's necessary. Nobody could function socially, online, or offline if they treated every friendly message as a potential threat. Tipton and her brother didn't exploit a flaw in Maya's judgment. They exploited a basic, universal assumption that virtually everyone relies on just to get through a normal week. And that's a big reason this case has stuck with true crime audiences the way it has. It's not a cautionary tale about being careless. It's a cautionary tale about how little carelessness is actually required for a plan like this to work when the person on the other end has enough patience and enough motivation to build it properly. Varied CTA number 1. If a case like this keeps you wondering how something this calculated can come together in the span of a single day, that's the kind of story we dig into on this channel. So if you haven't already, now's a good time to subscribe. We're just getting started. Back to the story. Chapter 4. The Night. The nightclub was loud, brightly lit, and packed with people. The sort of place where a young woman would reasonably expect to feel safe. There were cameras at the entrance, security working the door, a crowd big enough that anonymity itself felt like a form of protection. Nothing about walking into a public venue like that reads as dangerous, and by any reasonable standard, it shouldn't have been. Maya arrived a little after 11 that night, expecting a party. There wasn't one waiting for her, at least not the kind she thought she'd been invited to. At some point over the course of that night, she made her way back outside, into the parking lot, away from the noise, the lights, and the crowd of strangers who had no idea what was unfolding just beyond the doors. That parking lot is where everything Tipton, Pipkins, and Tyshawn had spent the entire day building finally came to a head. We're not going to walk you through the specific details of what happened next. Some things don't need to be described in detail to be understood, and there's no version of this story that gets more meaningful by dwelling on the mechanics of violence. What matters, what you need to know to understand everything that follows, is this. Maya did not go down without a fight. She resisted. She fought back against 2 people who had spent hours planning this moment. But 2 against 1, planned out in advance with time and intention behind it, rarely ends in the victim's favor. It didn't here either. By the time it was over, Maya had been seriously hurt. And then, somehow, it got worse. She was placed into the trunk of a car. Pause on that image for a moment, because it's the exact center of everything this story is about. Earlier that same day, she had still been with her family. A few hours before that, she had clocked out of a work shift like any other Saturday of her life. Just hours earlier, she had said yes to a single invitation from someone who seemed harmless. And now she was in the trunk of a car, in the dark, while the people responsible for putting her there settled into the seats up front as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Then they drove. There's a detail here that's easy to skip past, but that changes how you understand everyone involved. A parking lot outside a crowded nightclub is, in almost every practical sense, a bad place to commit a serious crime. There are cameras nearby. There are people coming and going all night. There's a real chance of being seen, interrupted, or caught in the act. And yet none of that stopped what happened. That tells you something about how far the plan had already gone by that point in the night. Far enough that the risk of being seen no longer mattered as much as finishing what had been started. This is the part of the case that's almost impossible to fully process, and it's also the moment that transforms this story from an assault into something far more calculated and far more disturbing. They didn't leave her behind in that parking lot and scatter in different directions. They got into the car together and drove, putting the whole city behind them, over the county line into Wilson County, putting distance between themselves and anyone who might have seen what happened. However long that drive actually lasted, Maya was alive for it, in the dark, with no way out, with no way of knowing where she was being taken or why. Eventually, they stopped on a quiet, undeveloped stretch of land off a rural road near Lebanon, Tennessee. Empty, remote, with no neighbors close enough to notice a single thing out of the ordinary. In the span of a single night, she'd gone from a venue packed with hundreds of strangers to an empty stretch of ground with no one around for miles. There, in the dark, on land that had absolutely nothing to do with Maya's life, this case reached its most devastating point. Maya Fuller lost her life on that property at the hands of people she had known for less than 24 hours combined. And when it was over, the three of them left her there and drove back home, as if a normal Saturday night had simply come to an end, leaving behind a daughter, a friend, an entire person, in a county she had no connection to at all, on a piece of ground she never would have chosen for herself. Every piece of this drive was a decision, choosing to keep driving instead of stopping, choosing a remote property instead of turning back. Every mile put between Nashville and that field was a mile someone chose to drive, with time to reconsider the entire way, and time that nobody used to change course. Chapter SISX, the silence. Back home, hour after hour went by with no word from Maya, and for a family who knew she always checked in, that silence alone was terrifying in a way that's hard to overstate. This wasn't a daughter who went dark for days at a time. Every hour that went by without a text, without a call, without any sign of her, chipped away at the assumption that everything was fine. She was reported missing. Then came a detail that made the situation feel immediately worse. Her car, a gray Toyota Camry, was found right where she had parked it outside the nightclub the night before. She had never come back for it. The vehicle sat there untouched, but there was no sign of her anywhere. For a family already fearing the worst, that single fact closed off almost every innocent explanation they might have wanted to believe. What followed was one of the hardest stretches of the entire case, a long, agonizing wait, repeated calls to anyone who might have crossed paths with her, retracing her last known movements again and again. That sick, growing certainty that something had gone deeply wrong, sitting alongside the desperate hope that they were wrong to feel that way, with absolutely nothing yet to confirm either possibility. Investigators, meanwhile, were working the case from a different angle entirely, trying to piece together her last known location, her last known contacts, and the last confirmed sighting of her before she vanished. Every hour that passed without an answer meant another hour of a family holding on to uncertainty that, deep down, most of them already sensed wasn't going to end well. Anyone who has ever waited on news about someone they love knows there's a particular kind of exhaustion that sets in after the first day or two. Not panic exactly, because panic requires a kind of energy that's hard to sustain for more than a few hours at a time, but something heavier and quieter than that. A low, constant hum of dread that doesn't let up long enough for anyone to sleep properly or eat properly or think about anything else. Maya's family lived inside that hum for the better part of a week, checking their phones every few minutes, calling anyone who might have seen her, driving past places she was known to frequent in case, somehow, she turned up exactly where they'd left off looking. It's the kind of waiting that doesn't show up in a case timeline, because nothing happened during it in the way investigators log events. But it happened to Maya's family in the fullest sense of the word. Every hour of it, every unanswered call, every silence on the other end of a phone that should have rung with her voice on it. On August 6th, 2022, roughly a week after she was last seen alive, that uncertainty was finally resolved, and it was resolved in the worst possible way. Chapter 7, The Discovery. The land where Maya had been left belonged to a family with no connection to any of this. Property owners who first noticed a strange odor on their land and assumed, reasonably, that it was some kind of animal. It's the kind of thing landowners in rural areas deal with more often than people realize, and there was nothing yet to suggest this was anything more than that. Then they noticed something else, near a hillside on their property, in a spot that looked almost like an old hidden bunker, tucked out of view from the road and easy to miss unless you happen to be standing in exactly the right place. What they found led directly to the answer every investigator and every member of Maya's family had been dreading for a full week. Her remains were recovered on that property, and the medical examiner ultimately confirmed what her family had feared from the moment her silence became impossible to explain away. Nothing about what happened to her had been sudden. Nothing about it had been an accident. And with that confirmation, the case shifted entirely, from a search for a missing young woman into a full homicide investigation, one that immediately spanned multiple counties and multiple law enforcement agencies. That wasn't a coincidence. The people responsible had been deliberate about putting distance between the crime and the evidence, moving Maya far from the nightclub, far from anyone who might have witnessed something, into a spot specifically chosen because almost nobody would ever have a reason to find it. Knowing how Maya died, tragically, turned out to be the easier part, proving exactly who was responsible. And building a case strong enough to hold up in court would take investigators the better part of a year. For the property owners who found her, that day never fully leaves them either. Discovering that kind of scene on land you own, land you walk regularly, land that's supposed to be yours in the most ordinary, unremarkable sense, that's its own quiet trauma, one that rarely gets attention in a case like this, but that's very real for the people who happen to be standing in the wrong place at the worst possible time. They didn't know Maya. They had no connection to anything that happened to her, and yet they became a permanent part of her story anyway, simply because of where 3 other people chose to leave her. VAERS CTA number 2. This is usually the point in a case where investigators either catch the break that cracks everything open or watch the trail go cold for good. If you want to see which one happened here, stick around. And if this is your first time on the channel, this is a good moment to subscribe so you don't miss where the rest of this story goes. Chapter EIHT, The Investigación. The Wilson County Sheriff's Office made this case personal almost from the very beginning. An innocent 22-year-old left on a rural property, miles from anyone who knew her, wasn't something they were willing to let quietly go cold. And they said as much publicly, holding a press conference to lay out what they knew so far and to formally ask the public for help. At that press conference, investigators confirmed a short, painful timeline. Maya last seen by her family on July 29th, her work shift the following afternoon, her last confirmed location at the nightclub on Antioch Pike, late that same night, her car recovered from the lot outside, untouched since she'd parked it, and her remains discovered on August 6th in the southeastern portion of Wilson County on a property she'd had no connection to at all. Investigators also confirmed something crucial for the case moving forward. Several persons of interest had already been identified, and detectives were actively pursuing multiple leads at once. To help move the investigation along, the sheriff's office announced a reward for information, which was eventually raised to $5,000 for anything leading to an arrest and prosecution. On top of that, Maya's family, working with an attorney representing them, built a separate, private reward fund fueled entirely by donations from friends, extended family, and strangers across the country who'd heard about the case and wanted to help however they could. Combined with the department's contribution, that fund eventually climbed past $20,000. In a case built on careful planning and a deliberate effort to hide the evidence across county lines, money on the table for information can be the single difference between a case that stalls out and one that finally breaks open. It gives people who might know something: a friend who overheard a conversation, an acquaintance who noticed something off, a concrete reason to come forward instead of staying quiet. And this case did eventually break open, but it took far longer than anyone wanted. Nearly a full year passed before investigators secured search warrants against multiple suspects, marking the real turning point in the case. In the months leading up to that moment, detectives worked through surveillance footage from the nightclub and surrounding businesses, pursued technological leads tied to phones and social media activity, and spoke with people connected to everyone involved, slowly building a case strong enough to eventually bring in front of a grand jury. One detail that came out of that process stands out because it reframes the entire crime. The people involved hadn't known each other for very long at all. In fact, by the time of the murder, everyone connected to that night had only become acquainted with one another over roughly the previous 24 hours. This wasn't a group of longtime friends acting on some slow-building resentment. It was near strangers, pulled together by a single overheard argument, coordinating with a level of planning that most people wouldn't expect from people who barely knew one another. In some ways, that makes the whole thing more disturbing, not less. It didn't take history or deep-seated animosity to produce this outcome. It took one bad night, one impulsive decision to escalate it, and 24 hours of planning among people who had almost no relationship to fall back on. Behind the scenes, this case also involved a level of interagency cooperation that isn't always guaranteed in cases that cross county lines. Wilson County handled the discovery of Maya's remains and the bulk of the homicide investigation, but detectives coordinated closely with Metro Nashville, where Maya was last seen alive, and with Rutherford County, where she lived. That kind of cooperation matters more than people realize. A crime that starts in one jurisdiction, involves witnesses in a second, and ends in a third can easily fall into gaps between departments if communication isn't tight. Gaps that, in less well-coordinated cases, have let suspects slip through entirely. That didn't happen here, and it's a large part of why this case eventually reached a resolution instead of joining the long list of cases that quietly go cold. The investigators working this case also made a point, publicly, of describing it as one they weren't willing to let fade from attention, even as the months stretched on with no arrests. That kind of sustained public pressure does real work in cases like this. Reward money climbing, repeated public statements, an active social media presence, keeping the case in front of people who might have information they don't realize is relevant. Somewhere in that year of pursuing leads, someone came forward with the piece of information that helped move this case from an open investigation with persons of interest to an indictment naming 3 specific people. Chapter 9, The Hearists. Almost exactly 1 year after Maya's body was discovered, a grand jury handed down indictments against 3 people: Tiana Tipton, her brother Tyshawn, and Lamira Pipkins. All 3 faced charges of first-degree murder and kidnapping. Tyshawn faced an additional charge on top of those: abuse of a corpse. All 3 were taken into custody and held without bond. For the first time in an entire year, Maya's family finally had names attached to faces, and with that, the first real sense that something resembling justice might actually be within reach. At a press conference following the arrests, investigators confirmed they had multiple forms of surveillance footage supporting the case against all 3 suspects, tracing movements and interactions in the hours leading up to the crime. What remained less clear, even at this stage, was a full and complete motive. Investigators acknowledged publicly that questions still lingered about exactly why an argument this small had escalated into a killing this deliberate. What was fully established, though, was the sequence of events: a disagreement, a message sent under false pretenses, an invitation extended in bad faith, and a plan that 3 people carried out together, in coordination, over the course of a single night. For a case that had remained unsolved for a full year, the arrests represented real, tangible progress. But an arrest is not the same thing as a resolution. And for Maya's family, the next stage of this case would prove to be just as difficult to sit through as the year of uncertainty that came before it. There's a particular kind of relief that comes with an arrest in a case like this, and it deserves to be named, honestly, because it's not the same as the relief people imagine. It's not closure. It's not peace. It's the relief of no longer having to wonder whether anyone will ever be held accountable at all, replaced almost immediately by a fresh set of questions. What will the trial look like? What will the sentences actually be? Whether the process still ahead will feel like justice, or whether it will feel like something else once it's finally over. For Maya's family, that new set of questions was about to get answered in a way that none of them fully expected, and not all at once. Valid CTA number 3. We're getting close to how this case actually resolved in court, and the outcome is going to frustrate you in ways you might not expect. Before we get there, if you're finding this story as unsettling as we did putting it together, drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from tonight. Chapter 10. The pleas. Justice in this case didn't arrive all at once, in a single moment of resolution. It came in 3 separate pieces, spread out across nearly a full year, and each one brought fresh pain to Maya's family in its own distinct way. The first piece came when Tiana Tipton, just days away from standing trial in front of a jury, stood up in court and pleaded guilty to everything she had been charged with: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse. According to reports from that day, the plea reportedly caught even the prosecution somewhat off guard. They had been fully prepared to take her case to trial and had a jury nearly seated. Instead, the judge sentenced her directly to life in prison. The woman at the very center of the plan that ended Maya's life would spend the rest of her own life behind bars. The second piece landed several months later, and it landed in a completely different way. Tyshawn, the brother who found Maya's profile and sent the message that lured her out that night, the one who got this whole chain of events rolling, did not plead guilty to murder. He pleaded to a significantly reduced charge: facilitation of especially aggravated kidnapping. His sentence was 12 years, with the possibility of release after serving only a portion of that time. In court, more of his specific role in that night finally came to light, filling in gaps that had remained unclear since the arrests. He admitted he had been present. He admitted he had witnessed the assault take place. He even admitted that he caught his sister's instruction to put Maya in the trunk of the car, but he maintained, through his account in court, that he had never personally seen her actually placed inside the vehicle. His version of events was that he had followed behind in his sister's car and lost sight of it somewhere along the way, in the dark, before losing track of exactly what happened next. In short, his own account amounted to this: he set the whole night rolling, and then claims he looked away from precisely how it ended. Prosecutors explained their reasoning behind the plea deal in fairly plain terms afterward. Different people involved in the same crime carry different levels of legal responsibility depending on what the evidence can actually prove. And in this case, the evidence supported that Tyshawn had lured Maya to that location and had been present for what followed, but had not personally carried out the killing itself. That legal distinction, however accurate on paper, did very little to soften the blow for Maya's family. In court, Maya's mother read a statement making it painfully clear that 12 years came nowhere close to matching the true weight of what her daughter had lost. A lifetime cut short by a plan that never could have worked without the message Tyshawn chose to send. The third and final piece came the following spring, nearly 2 years after Maya's death. Lamira Pipkins, the last of the 3 still awaiting trial, pleaded guilty on the very morning a jury was set to be selected for her case. Her plea was to facilitation of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to 20 years. 3 guilty pleas. 3 very different outcomes for 3 people who had each played a distinct role in ending one young woman's life. Outcomes that, when placed side by side, tell a story about how the legal system weighs responsibility that doesn't always match how a grieving family weighs it. Each of these 3 moments in court carried its own particular weight for Maya's family, and it helps to understand why. When Tipton entered her plea, the family walked into that courtroom prepared for a trial, for weeks, possibly months, of sitting through evidence, of hearing every detail relitigated in front of a jury, of not knowing how it would end. Instead, they got a guilty plea and a life sentence in a single afternoon, which is its own strange kind of whiplash, relief, and anticlimax arriving at the same time, with no real space in between them to process either one. Tyshawn's plea deal months later reopened that same wound in a completely different way. Where Tipton's plea had at least matched the severity the family expected, Tyshawn's plea deal landed as something closer to a second injury, a legal outcome that technically closed his case while doing almost nothing to close the emotional one. Watching the person whose actions started everything receive the shortest sentence of the three is the kind of detail that doesn't fade with time. It's something a family carries with them permanently, long after the courtroom has emptied out and the case has technically been resolved. By the time Pipkins entered her plea the following spring, there was a strange, exhausted familiarity to the process for everyone involved. A family that had now sat through this exact ritual 3 separate times, watching 3 separate people acknowledge their role in the same night, each walking away with a different number attached to the rest of their life. There's no version of that process that feels like closure in the way the word is usually meant. It's simply the legal system reaching its final answer, whether or not that answer feels proportional to what was actually lost. Chapter 11, Thich he wesht, OFDH he, OFDH he sentences. Here's where this case leaves you with something genuinely difficult to sit with. The woman who ultimately carried out the killing received life in prison, the most severe sentence available outside of the death penalty, and one that ensures she will never again be free. The woman who helped corner Maya in that parking lot and took part in the assault against her received 20 years. And the man whose actions started the whole chain of events, the one who searched for a stranger online, studied her profile, sent the message, and built the trap that pulled her in, received the lightest sentence of the 3. 12 years, with a realistic path to release after serving only a portion of that time. Of everything this case asks Maya's family to accept, that particular gap tends to be the hardest part to make peace with. The person who struck the very first match, the one without whom none of this would have ever happened at all, walked away with the least amount of time to answer for it. But there's an important distinction to draw here. A closed case is not the same thing as a fully answered one. No sentence, however long, actually answers the real question sitting underneath this whole story. Why? Why does one small disagreement, the kind of thing most people forget about within a week, end with a 22-year-old woman losing her life and her body left on a piece of land she had no connection to whatsoever? How do 3 people, none of them older than 21, look at someone they'd barely known for a single day and decide, through a series of small, deliberate choices, that she doesn't get to see another week of her own life? There's no sentence long enough to answer that. There's only the outcome and a family left to carry it. Chapter 12, 3 pre-POP, tree pre-pre, tree pre, tree pre, tree pre. Let's lay the 3 of them side by side one final time, because the shape of this case only really comes into focus when you see all 3 roles at once. Tiana Tipton was the origin point, the person who turned a forgettable argument into a decision to cause serious harm, and who ultimately pulled the trigger herself. Her sentence reflects that. Life in prison, the clearest possible legal acknowledgement of direct responsibility for a killing. Lamira Pipkins was the second set of hands, present for the assault, willing to help carry out a plan that had already been set in motion by the time she was fully looped in. 20 years, a sentence that acknowledges serious, direct participation without placing her at the very center of the decision to kill. And Tyshawn was the architect of the opportunity itself, the person without whom none of the rest of this would have had a chance to happen at all. No message, no invitation, no way to lure Maya anywhere. And yet his sentence, 12 years with early release possible, ended up the lightest of the 3, because the legal system draws its lines around direct action rather than around causation. He didn't strike the blow or pull the trigger, and under the law, that distinction carried enormous weight, even though, in every practical sense, his decision to send one message on one afternoon is the reason this entire case exists at all. That's the tension this case leaves behind, and it's not a tension with a clean resolution. The law measures what someone directly did. A grieving family measures what someone's actions made possible. Those 2 ways of measuring responsibility don't always land in the same place, and this case is a stark example of exactly how far apart they can end up. Kloss. Maya Fuller wasn't a headline, and she shouldn't be remembered as one. She was 22 years old. She was the daughter her own mother called a genius without a moment's hesitation. She was ambitious, close with her family, dependable at work, and by every account available, someone with an entire life still stretched out ahead of her, all of it taken over something that, by any reasonable measure, should have amounted to absolutely nothing. If there's one lesson buried inside a case like this, it's an uncomfortable one, and it deserves to be said plainly. Nothing about the invitation that ended Maya's life gave off any warning signs. It looked like an ordinary Saturday night sent by someone who came across as harmless enough to trust without a second thought. Be thoughtful about who you let get close to you online, especially in situations where there's tension in the background you can't fully see or understand. There's no way to predict what a stranger is capable of once they've made up their mind about something. Maya's story deserves to be remembered for who she actually was, not simply for how it ended. Not as a cautionary tale reduced to a single lesson, and not as a name that only exists inside the context of a crime committed against her. She was a daughter first, a sister, a coworker who showed up on time. Someone with plans for her own future that had absolutely nothing to do with the three people who ultimately decided none of those plans would happen. Cases like this one tend to raise a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. How do you protect yourself from a threat that's specifically designed not to look like one? There isn't a clean piece of advice that fully closes that gap, and it would be dishonest to pretend there is. What you can do is stay a little more deliberate about who gets close to you when there's any tension in the air you can't fully account for, and trust that instinct if something quietly doesn't sit right, even when you can't immediately explain why.